Thanks again for joining us, and welcome to EcoVapor's Regulatory Roundup webinar. Good morning. I'm your host, James, with Prism Group. We have a big group this morning, and that's an indicator of how important today's topic is to the oil and gas business. Let's cover just a few housekeeping items here before we get started. Just a friendly reminder that today's webinar is being recorded. Attendees are in listen-only mode. If you do have a question on the GoToWebinar control panel, there's a little question box. Please submit it. We're collecting those questions, and then Jeff will cover the Q&A near the end of the discussion. There's also a free download PDF of the slide deck that the panelists will be discussing today, so be sure to download that. That's going to be a great resource. And if you do experience an issue with your computer audio, I guess you can't hear me, but if you can read this, use the dial-in function. Now, let's meet our panel of experts. Peter, let's start with you.
Good morning, everyone. Thank you for attending our webinar today. This is interesting. We're seeing folks from DJ Basin to the Bakken to the Marcellus, Permian, and Eagle Ford. This is great. We've got independents, majors, regulators, some consultants, and even a few competitors, which we take as a great compliment. So thank you for attending today. Lots of changes going on right now, so appreciate that. And I'm just a few things about myself. I'm the co-founder of EcoVapor. We've been doing this for a while, and so thank you. I want to also introduce Samantha Holroyd and Kat Galloway, if you both just give us a little background on yourselves.
Thanks, Peter. I'll start. This is Samantha Holroyd, Sam. Appreciate the opportunity to be here with you guys today and to share my perspectives. I am the sole proprietor of Golden Advisory Services, and I work with management teams and boards, helping them think about ESG strategies as we move towards the next generation of energy and how we can be better stewards of our world. Kat?
Good morning, this is Kat Galloway. I'm the president of Bright Sky Environmental, calling in today from Austin, Texas. My background is primarily in air permitting and compliance. My skill set is really geared to the state of Texas, so I do a lot of work in the Permian and the Eagle Ford, and very happy to be here this morning.
Thank you. And Mr. Wilson is product management person here at EcoVapor, and Jeff, thank you for being a part of this as well.
Certainly, thank you.
Just a few words about EcoVapor. We've been in the gas and vapor stream management space since 2010. We've been deploying vapor capture technologies during that time, focusing on produced vapors at oil and gas sites. And basically, our focus is to put out the flares. That's our goal. Our topics today are focused on, obviously, regulatory and ESG. We want to talk about pending changes in state air regulations, the differences between ESG and regulatory compliance, or we've also looked at that as EHS in the past. The differences in regulatory treatment of vapor recovery before tanks and directly from the tanks, the process versus control determination that is important and its effect in air permitting. Basically talking about how environmental performance is also good business, the future trends that we're seeing in regulations and ESG and the potential issues that come from that. And then the roadmap to zero flaring by 2030. So it's a very full agenda. Let's get to it.
Yeah, so I'd like to start off today's discussion by first talking about some upcoming state initiatives. Okay, so we're going to talk about state. We're going to talk about some federal initiatives a little bit later. But coming from Texas in the Permian Basin, really what I'm seeing right now from my clients and from the regulatory community is that we're really focusing on the drive to reduce flaring, venting and flaring for that matter. So for example, in Texas, there's a big initiative from the Railroad Commission to start really reducing flaring that's going on. So one of the recent regulatory changes is a change to Rule 32, which is now requiring operators to start disclosing more information on the circumstances of the flaring that they're doing. So really, we're in a data collection phase right now. And we all know that after data collection comes more regulations. So we're definitely seeing some focus on the drive to reduce flaring in Texas. From a New Mexico standpoint, we're also looking at reducing flaring. We're coming up against issues of ozone non-attainment and just flaring in general. So one of the rules on the table right now is a proposed natural gas waste rule, which is currently in review right now in public comment. And that rule would require that by 2020, starting in 2022, that upstream and midstream operators have to start reducing their venting and flaring in order to get to a 98% capture rate by 2026. And there would be a ban on routine venting and flaring. We're also looking at ozone precursor rules. So again, that is in an effort to bring us into ozone non-attainment, and that's applying potentially to the Permian Basin and the San Juan Basin. And the idea, there are a lot of components of that rule, but from a tank and a flaring perspective, some of those rules are potentially going to require additional control on storage tanks, low emitting storage tanks, and actually requiring control that's more stringent than Quad A. So if we go to the next slide, there's also some ozone attainment issues that are going on in Colorado. And let's have Peter discuss what's going on there.
Thanks, Kat. Yeah, here in our backyard in the Denver Metro and North Front Range, you can see the chart that shows the trend and the line on ozone levels. And this is one of those things where two things can be true at the same time. If the ozone levels are coming down in the Front Range, and there's been a lot of effort to make that happen. You can see we're non-attainment first in 1998, and recently we're all the way down to 78. But at the same time, you can see the 2015 standard. And last year in 2020, this area was the non-attainment level changed from moderate to serious, which dropped the major source threshold to 100 tons per year. It appears that, if nothing else changes, that in 2022 we could drop to a severe non-attainment, which would drop that threshold further down to 25 tons per year. Concurrently, Colorado has started a GHG reduction process as well, and is looking for approximately a 45% reduction in GHGs from the oil and gas sector by 2025. Sam?
Yes, Peter, thank you for the handoff. So it's great that we've had a chance to already start talking about some of the focus areas in some operating basins. But I think one of the messages I want to put on the table today is helping some thought evolution, we'll call it, that ESG is not your EHS or your HSE program. If we think about EHS, HSE, it's really a collection of regulations and regulatory reporting that are required in order to operate your business. And of course, we all support those because we know it makes for better business. Let's talk about what ESG is. Look, ESG has become a global initiative, and it's driving investors' capital deployment, it's driving their discipline, and it's becoming a series of targets to measure corporate performance. Here are just some examples of how you should think about the differentiation between what we might call the regulatory requirement efforts that your organization should be undertaking, and how you might be starting to evolve into a broader thought process around how you have corporate performance measurements and how you can change the actual valuations of your business. I think we'd like to roll a poll at this time and give the audience a chance to give us some feedback on your perspectives. So here on the screen, we just want to understand a little bit about your background and how you're thinking about ESG. And while you do that, I'll give you a few statistics. In 2015, 70 to 75% of the S&P 500 companies were issuing some sort of a sustainability report. By 2019, over 90% of S&P 500 companies were formally addressing some component of ESG publicly, whether it was on their website, having a formal sustainability or an ESG report. Because of this growth in reporting, there are a variety of initiatives to move to more formal disclosures. So we, of course, are seeing an evolution and a transition, just as you heard Kat and Peter describe in terms of the regulatory reporting and compliance. We're also seeing it at a broader, more corporate level. Okay, so it looks like almost half of those of you responsive here talk about the ESG, but already has become an active discussion. But you're probably all still trying to get your hands around what is ESG and how to integrate it both into your corporation and into your culture. I'm surprised to see a pretty meaningful category there or number there of no effect at all on your business. I suspect it's coming. If you're, whether you're public or private, I think you will start to see some initiatives that start to influence your involvement in this. But then it's also great to see you've already got that so many, a third of our respondents already have organizational ESG metrics established. Let me give you kind of a view of where we're going with this in the future. So there are two primary organizations that are driving change here. We have got the Task Force Climate-Related Financial Disclosures and the Sustainability Accounting Standards Boards. In 2018, about 1,000 companies, which had approximately $12 trillion in market cap, were endorsing the Task Force Climate-Related Financial Disclosures, the TCFD, for sustainability disclosures. By February 2020, so 2 years later, over 1,700 companies, so almost double that number of companies, were now supporting the TCFD initiatives for disclosures around your sustainability and ESG initiatives. And so we want to move now to the next slide, James, if we could, because this sort of sets the stage for some of the questions that organizations should be focusing on. Next slide, please. Sorry, slide 9. There we go. We want to think about ESG not as your regulatory compliance requirements to run your business, but more as a way of creating value. And here are some of the questions that I work with management teams and boards when we start to think about how ESG can influence and affect the way we run our business and the way we think about tomorrow and 5 to 10 years from now. Let's move to the next slide. Some recent developments are happening. Some of you may have heard that the NASDAQ has approached the SEC to start requiring disclosures around some of the key components of ESG. The first one that the NASDAQ has focused on has been in the social bucket here, the blue bucket on this pie diagram. And they've started to ask about disclosures around the demographics of your organizational, the social profile of the organization, as well as your board. We can only anticipate, just again, as you've heard from the regulatory side of the business, that as we start with one foot in terms of disclosure requirements, we can expect that to broaden itself with respect to both environmental and governance topics. So the NASDAQ approached SEC in 2020 there are rumors that by 2022, the SEC will start to require some of these disclosures in your 10Ks. So I guess the point is we're in infancy. There are already some great structural and foundational guidance metrics being put together. But you can anticipate this to just continue to be a really important part of your corporate profile and how your investors think about you creating value for them and for your own business. Next slide, I think.
Well, let's, Kat, go ahead.
Yeah, so bringing the corporate back to the environmental. Okay, that's a big component of what we're here to talk about today. Really, we're gonna focus on flaring, and you know, why did we want to come back to flaring? Well, from an emissions perspective, flaring is a viable way to destroy your hydrocarbons that you may be emitting at the site, right? The problem with that is that you're also destroying a potential revenue stream, and that's your vapor coming off of tanks and trucks. So we're gonna talk a little bit about flaring, okay? Flares are going to have regulated pollutants that you're emitting. You've got your VOCs and your products of combustion, okay? Flaring is also a source of CO2, so we're talking ESG part of the house on that. And also the extent of your flaring can impact your air permitting perspective as far as what your emissions are at your site and what threshold you're going to be in from a permitting perspective. And I think, Peter, you've got a few ideas that you wanted to share on flaring as well.
Well, basically, where's this coming from? As you can see on the left-hand side, there's the vapors that are generated from basically the oil in water tanks, where you've got that pressure drop coming off your separators and then dropping into the tanks. You also have vapor that's generated from truck loading. And so you've got multiple sources, and when you're trying to address it, in the past we've kind of looked at basically just the oil, but it expands beyond that. So this is a just something that we wanted to talk about, the different types and sources, and how this gets into permitting. Kat, you want to jump in here, and then I can talk about it a little bit more.
Sure. Yeah. So the types of flaring that we typically see at our upstream and midstream sites. Let's stop upstream. So one type of flaring is high pressure flaring. So that is flaring of your gas if you don't have a gas pipeline in service, right? So you've got to send your first stage separator gas somewhere, okay? So that gas can typically be high in methane. It's also typically regulated by your state agencies, like your Railroad Commission or your Conservation Commission, all right? There's also low pressure flaring, which is typically routine flaring, okay? So this is coming off of sources that are flaring all the time. So it may be your sources that are coming off of your oil and gas tanks, your oil tanks, your water tanks, your trucking, and you can see large volumes of flash gas that are being flared, especially at central facilities that are coming off of your tanks. So this gas has lower methane content, but it's very rich. And typically the low pressure flaring, the routine flaring, is not necessarily regulated by your oil and gas commission, but it will be in your air permit. So we're definitely tracking that, we're quantifying it, and it plays a big effect into your air permit. So if we could roll to the next slide.
Let me just make one more point on that slide. One of the things that's interesting about that, since it's not regulated by the COGCC or other regulatory agencies, is if you capture it, it's considered additive and can qualify for carbon credits. So if any of you on the call today are interested in increasing carbon credits and how that works, certainly that low pressure gas is an opportunity there.
Mhm. So the next couple of slides we're going to go through, we're going to compare an example of a vapor recovery tower, and we're going to contrast that and compare it to vapor recovery itself. So from an air permitting perspective, I've done dozens and dozens of air permits for large central facilities that have a vapor recovery tower. Okay, so I'm sure y'all all know this, but a vapor recovery tower is basically an additional separator in the system where you're bringing down your operating pressure before we get to the oil tanks of a low pressure, like 5 or 6 pounds. Okay, a couple of things I want to point out here. For a VRT, you're not controlling emissions from your trucking or from your produced water tanks. This is really just focusing on the oil stream. Now, when we permit it, we have to quantify the emissions that are coming from the storage tanks after the VRT. And the way that you do that is you can either take some sampling, get some measurements, or you can use a process simulator. Most states allow you to use either or. What's interesting is that sometimes I've seen when we do a model off of the tanks after a VRT, the model will indicate that there are 0 emissions. And if that were true, that would be awesome. But I don't really believe that there are 0 emissions after a VRT. And I've had some regulators push back on that in the past. So what do we do when we get that there's 0 emissions? Well, basically what I have to do is I have to crank up the pressure on that VRT in order to generate some emissions. So we have some challenges that we have to deal with. It's a good option, but there are some issues that we have. Also, we have pressure swings that we have to model, and it also relies on a VRU, which will typically have some downtime. So that's kind of what I've seen in the permitting perspective for VRTs. If we roll to the next slide, I'd like to talk about how we permit tank vapor recovery systems. And maybe Peter, if you could walk through this and give everyone a little bit of background on how your technology works.
Yeah, you bet. This is the, I think this is really the change that we're seeing as far as more complete capture. One of the reasons that VRTs came along is basically pipelines started decreasing the amount of oxygen they would let into their pipelines. VRUs used to pull gas directly off of oil tanks, but the oxygen became an issue. So VRTs became kind of an alternative way to make that happen, at least capture part of it. And so one of the things that we've done at EcoVapor is to develop systems that remove that oxygen. And so now, instead of using a VRT on the upstream side of the tanks, what we're doing is we're taking that flash gas that can contain oxygen, running it through the same types of VRUs that you use on a VRT, but instead running it through the 0.2 system, remove the oxygen, and then blending that gas with whatever's coming off the separators, so that you can basically capture everything, all the vapors at the site.
And I think what that allows you to do is, since you're capturing your vapors, you're no longer relying on a flare or a combustor to destroy those emissions, right? So we're reducing our products of combustion, but also increasing our VOC control.
So this is one where we're just trying to summarize what we looked at on those slides before. Is obviously there's similar functions between vapor tower recovery and tank vapor recovery, and you can see those top half or so is how they're similar. But let's focus, in the interest of time, on the differences. If you're looking to capture 100% of the oil tank vapor, a vapor tower is not going to do it. The only way to do that is actively pulling gas off those tanks. Same time, if you want to capture the vapor coming off the water tanks, you can combine that with the vent pipes that come off the oil tanks. Tank truck vapor capture, again, the same thing, because the oxygen in those trucks that has to be routed to a flare unless you do this. I think that the next two are really interesting in that in this case, if you're capturing off the tanks, you can also do simultaneous recovery using the same VRU, just one VRU, to recover gas from tanks and other low pressure vessels. So you're getting, kind of a bigger bang for your buck as far as that VRU goes. And then instead of just letting tank pressures kind of manage themselves and whatever's coming in hopefully is balanced by what's going out, by using a VRU on the tanks, you are actively controlling those tank pressures and making sure that staying below those springs in the hatches and not letting anything vent or flare. So we said we were going to talk a little bit about permitting differences in whether something was considered process or control. And I'm going to talk about the left side of this and basically some EPA guidance, and Kat's going to talk a little bit about what does that mean. And so on the left-hand side, what we've taken is the 3 questions that the EPA put out in 1996 as to whether a piece of equipment, vapor recovery system on tanks, is considered process, which affects PTE, or control, which doesn't. And when you look at the questions, especially in this light, it's focused on whether or not it's profitable. The EPA basically said if it's not profitable, the companies are putting it out to control air pollution. If it's profitable, it's put out there like any other piece of equipment, like a separator. And so the difference is, Kat, take it away. This is where it gets interesting.
Yeah, and so this is something that we really started looking at. For me personally, was when Quad O came out, and we were trying to understand what are the potential emissions from oil and gas sites. And so if something can be considered process, it is in line with the system, right? You're able to take that, the emissions reduction and build that into your potential to emit, right? And so if you can lower your potential to emit, you're going to be affected in your permitting categories. So you're able to take a lower PTE and be able to have less stringent air permitting recommendations here. So what's interesting to me is that although EPA seems to have a clear description of what's considered a process or control, not all of the states consider it so clear. So being a Texan, the TCEQ allows you to take credit for VRUs. You can take up to 100% capture on your VRUs, which really helps from a permitting perspective because you are capturing that vapor. Some other states require a little bit more background to be submitted to prove that it is a profit stream. You are making money off of it, and that would be states like New Mexico, Wyoming allow you to take that control. But some other states are not. I know that Colorado doesn't let you incorporate that into your PTE. So it's definitely an ongoing discussion. But from my perspective, if you're capturing that vapor and you're selling it, it's part of your system. It's part of the reason why you built your site the way you did. And I consider that to be process.
So let's talk about profitability. If that's the key consideration here,
Yeah.
If you can reach compliance and make a profit, well, that's a good idea. So, it makes sense. Operators have challenged us. Okay, EcoVapor, what's the, is this for real? And so an operator up in the Powder River Basin decided that they were going to run a parallel system. Basically, the first 77 days was with a VRT, and the next 77 days was with full capture off the tanks. And without belaboring every one of the points here, I think that you can see, as far as gas captured, there was a 37% increase. As far as the BTU of the gas, it was quite a bit richer than was coming off the tanks. And the operator, not EcoVapor, calculated that the net present value of that full capture was twice what the partial or VRT capture was. So no doubt it was profitable, and in Wyoming this would qualify as process.
So I think the effect that you're seeing with vapor capture, okay, is that compared to a VRT, at least from this scenario, right, we're reducing VOC emissions. Look at the regulated pollutants on the left side of the slide, but also we're seeing the reduction in flaring because we're not having to routinely flare this gas all the time. We're seeing reductions in CO and NOx, which are also important if you are operating a site where you have a lot of engines, right, and you've got NOx and CO emissions that may be, kissing that Title V level. So being able to reduce those emissions are helpful as well. When you're reducing your flaring emissions, you're also going to be reducing your CO2, your COE equivalents. So you get kind of a double bang here that you're really able to reduce your greenhouse gas emissions as well. So I think those are real things, that we're seeing from a reduction in flaring perspective.
Yeah, Kat,
Okay.
let me jump in here, because this is where, from the ESG perspective, it gets really interesting. I think you heard me say early in the presentation that ESG is a global initiative, and just today, the panelists, before our session today, we were going back and forth on some recent news that will affect some of you as operators in the Permian and in the state of Texas. We understand that France recently rejected a proposal to build an LNG plant facility because the gas that was being supplied to that LNG plant was actually sourcing from Texas. And as far as France was concerned, Texas was not considered to be a responsibly sourced gas location. And that had not become a priority for Texas and the Permian Basin as far as the coverage. So here's just one small example that is going to start driving our initiatives, not only on, as Kat and Peter have shared with you, on your requirements to operate your business, but when you start to think about the 3 and 5 and 10-year vision on capturing value beyond at the wellhead, but truly having an offtake, having creating that demand. This is another perfect example where this greenhouse gas effect and the ESG impact from a global perspective will help us, or will be a part of our business decisions on a day-to-day basis.
So we're going to talk a little bit about the administration changes. Things are moving quickly. I think it's hard for us to keep up with what's going on a day-to-day basis. But I think bringing it back to a federal level, we're definitely seeing that this administration is going to be tackling climate change, right? And so this was just a snap, right off of the White House. But there's a lot going on. So let's go to the next slide, and we're going to look at just a couple of the initiatives that this administration is handling immediately. So number one, we're going to be joining the Paris Agreement. You may have heard that the administration has now revoked the Keystone oil pipeline permit. And we now have a 60-day suspension on oil and gas permitting on federal lands and waters. We'll see if that's going to be a 60-day suspension or what's going to happen next. But our federal leases account for a quarter of our crude oil output, so that's significant. And something that we see with any change in administration is, they're going to want to review all the changes that were made in the previous administration. So that's what Biden's team is doing now. He has asked all the executive departments to go back and review regulations and other actions over the last 4 years. And has put, directly out to the EPA a list of rules that he wants the EPA to reconsider, which includes ozone NAAQS. It includes our oil and gas Quad O A. So there's a lot of movement right now to go, reevaluate these rules. There was an executive action today again I haven't digested all of it, but we're definitely seeing, movements to, try to get to net zero, which is, a big component of the climate plan. So if we go to the next slide.
Hey, Kat, if we could pause there for 1 second. I just want to build on this fantastic slide, because I think we've captured a lot of the very, very, if you will, immediate targets that the new administration has, actions and targets. And again, let's remind ourselves that what Kat has shown here is really all about getting back to the regulatory reporting and the requirements. These are not part yet of the bigger picture from ESG, which is a voluntary disclosure at this point in our world, or ultimately required disclosures. But again, you're seeing the groundwork being laid, and this is simply focusing on the environmental part of ESG, but you're seeing the groundwork being laid in the regulatory requirements, and you will anticipate, or should anticipate, that these initiatives will become and will have carry-on effects that will result in either your corporation having self-imposed ESG disclosures, or you may find yourself looking down the barrel of SEC requirements for forced disclosures as we evolve. And so this is a really important foundation, and I think it's so new and so fresh that it's a great place to just take a deep breath, not be quite reactionary, which will be our immediate response to the regulatory reporting, but also starting to integrate it into the bigger picture and the way you think about your corporate vision over the next 10 years or so. And maybe that's a good place, Kat, for your transition.
Yeah, thank you for that, Sam. I get so focused on the regulatory that it's good to pull out to the broader picture. So let's, I think the next slide is kind of, my final thoughts, and then we can get back to Sam as well. So as we're looking at this strategy, okay, we've got our state regulators hoping to reduce flaring. We're going to be reducing our VOC emissions as we look at ozone non-attainment. So from my perspective, what I do with a lot of my clients is how do we get there? All right, what steps are we going to be taking over the next few years, the next 10 years? And so I guess we kind of start with emissions management, which means as you're building your facilities, how can we build this facility to inherently have less emissions? Okay, can we make it a tankless facility? Can we install vapor capture? Right? Can we retrofit existing facilities so that they will inherently be emitting less? Okay. One important thing is when we're talking about vapor capture and reducing our flaring, we have to have somewhere to send that gas. Okay, we can't sell it if we don't have pipeline takeaway capacity. So I think there's a whole separate focus on how do we get the infrastructure there? How do we handle our takeaway? What other uses do we have of the gas at the site? Can we use it to power a supercomputer, which is going to find a vaccine, right? So there are all sorts of interesting things you can do with that gas on the site. Then from there, from an operational perspective, what other things in our daily lives at the sites can we do to reduce those emissions, right? If you know you're going to have pipelines down for a few days, can we perhaps consider not flaring and maybe shutting in the site for a couple days for that maintenance? These are big questions that you need to think about from your corporate strategy. And so there are lots of ideas that are on the table right now. But I think as we start to incorporate these ideas, we can get there. And I think it's possible, but we definitely need to start the groundwork now.
Yeah, I'll echo some of your comments, Kat, and then turn it maybe back over to Peter. Look, ESG is really, it's here to stay. And it's going to become the modern way of evaluating your corporate performance and also the way to create value. And what I would encourage folks to do is look at some of your peers. We do have some wonderful peers in the industry that are leading the way. They're making standards and vision for 10 years out or 20 years out or 30 years out. If you've had a chance to read Larry Fink's report from Blackstone, CEO of Blackstone, he talks about his vision for Blackstone 2050 and his climate impact or climate change impact. And so you're seeing this across the board happening at the investor level, happening at the, if you will, the customer level. There are customers, obviously we talked about the situation in France, there are going to be customers who are going to make choices as to whether or not to accept our products based on how we approach ESG. I think the wonderful thing here is you already have the framework around it with your reporting requirements and compliance. If you take the leadership role to make it a vision 2030, you'll be in a great place to succeed. Peter.
And we'll just do a quick wrap up and then roll into the questions. And I think some takeaways from this is clearly that and we've seen this over the 11 years that EcoVapor's been in business. The pace and then the pressure of change for reducing emissions is definitely increasing. One of the things that I think is the most accelerating part of that is the interest by investors in ESG. That is going beyond the regulatory changes, and those are substantial by themselves. As Kat talked about, we've got several states that have been leading regulatory change. We see the change in statewide Rule 32 in Texas and the reporting that's coming along with that is definitely it's going to lead to a change there as well. Like it or not, we know that the Biden administration is definitely changing things in addressing GHGs as we have in as Colorado is doing right now. That 45% is something that definitely got a lot of attention. And it's time to start planning. The sooner we plan, the less disruptive this can be. And we're able to put solutions in place. So on to our Q&A.
Okay, panel, we've got some questions from a number of different people. One of the questions might be for you, Kat, is it common to flare during completions in Texas?
It can be, yes. From a Quad A perspective, there's a focus to do green completions, which is to reduce that flaring of the gas. But the problem is if there's no pipeline capacity to take away that gas during a completion, you really don't have a choice. So yes, you will see flaring. And the regulation of that flaring in Texas during a completion specifically lives with the Railroad Commission. So the Railroad Commission regulates that from a regulatory perspective. The TCEQ, the Texas Commission on Environmental Quality, takes over the environmental and the air permitting for that site after the completion and once the facility is into its routine regular production.
Okay. Before I forget, audience, contact details for Kat and Sam and EcoVapor at the end of the presentation. If you download that handout, you can get a hold of Kat and Sam and EcoVapor on your later if we don't answer your questions or if you have further questions. Another one, when calculating PTE, should you include methane and ethane?
So typically, methane and ethane are not considered to be VOCs. They're not volatile. So your PTE for VOCs starts at C3. Okay.
There's a question here that I'm going to try to summarize. Basically, what I think the person is asking is, how do you permit an EcoVapor unit with a flare or combustor? I mean, what are the emissions? Is it just the emissions from what goes to the flare? Or how would you handle that permitting compared to permitting a VRT and the VRU off the tank?
Right, great.
Before the tanks.
So the way that I would permit the VRU with the eco vapor system would be to assume a certain capture efficiency of those vapors. So that might be 98% capture, it might be 99% capture. So the remaining emissions that are not captured are going to be your 1 or 2% of the tank vapors. Okay, so those are going to be your VOCs. You will also need to permit the flare to handle any other. So for example, if you have a high pressure event, that's typically not required to be permitted because that might be an upset. So your emissions from your flare should theoretically be very low unless you have some other scenario of emissions going to the flare. But you should permit the pilot on the flare. Additionally, what I recommend is that we always see that VRUs are going to have some downtime. And that would be whether or not there is any other enhancement on that VRU. One thing, for example, in Texas is that they require an alternate operating scenario. So if you expect that your VRU is going to be down for a certain percentage of the time, you are required to calculate the emissions of that scenario. So you would basically consider a VRU downtime, and in that case, you would send it to the flare. So it can get complex. If you have any specific requirements or a site that you want for me to look at, feel free to contact me.
Yeah, but doesn't it also, I mean, based on your comments earlier, doesn't the process versus control issue make this somewhat state dependent on how you would permit recovery from the tank?
Yeah, absolutely. So different states are going to require for you to report out your uncontrolled versus your controlled emissions. And so you'll just have to follow whatever the requirements are for your state.
Okay. This might be for you, Sam. I have a question here. I'll just read it to you. Do you see ESG as the driver for increased air emission reductions beyond regulation? It reminds me of natural gas star, where the industry volunteered to implement practices that were not really necessarily driven by regulation.
Yeah, it's a great question. And I'll tell you, one of the things I try to communicate with people, both inside and outside our industry, is that I think that the oil and gas industry is one of the best self-regulating industries on earth. And so when you think about the initiatives that the Department of Energy or the environmental, the EPA, or even the SEC undertake, usually it's because we have started to do this for ourselves, whether it's for our industry or for our communities that we work in. And so, yes, I think for our industry, we will be leading the charge. What I will caution you on, though, is that organizations like Nike and McDonald's and Nordstrom are already making strides in becoming more green and more climate friendly, more environmentally friendly, more socially aware in terms of some of their social considerations. And so while we can take a lot of control of what we are doing, especially around air emissions for our business, we also need to think much broader to continue to compete for capital in the private and public markets.
Exactly. Hey, Jeff,
yeah.
Jeff, I got an email directly that maybe I can bring up. I got an email requesting additional information on how the eco vapor system works. Is there a catalyst on board, or how is this enhancing a traditional VRU?
Peter, you want to do that?
Sure. And that's, I didn't plant that question, I just want to say.
No,
That's a great question. Yeah, what we're doing is a catalytic reaction that removes or converts the free oxygen in the gas stream into CO2 and water. And there are no emissions from the eco vapor unit that are known as a 02. That is all combined with the gas and goes downstream. It doesn't trip any conditions for the pipeline. It's always in minute amounts, but that's really the catalytic process is what makes the enables the recovery of gas from the tanks, gas from the water tanks, tank truck loading. If with that you're able to basically put gas into the pipelines that can be as well below the usual 10 part per million of oxygen limit. It's a and any more questions on that, happy to answer offline, or we can continue here, but that's exactly what we're doing.
Okay, there's
Thanks.
a question, can the EcoVapor unit be used in applications other than tanks? Yes, it can. There's one here about, I'm going to summarize it, and if I don't do justice to your question, forgive me. Basically saying, don't you have to have a flare, because if the VRU goes down, you have to have some way of dealing with that vapor rather than shutting in the well. And I would say, yeah, you will always have some flare for downtime or emergency situations.
Jeff, let me
Yeah.
pile on there for a second. There's one operator that we know of in the Permian Basin, and it's a household name. They have taken the position of, rather than having a flare as a backup, using a separate VRU as a backup.
Okay.
And so if the one VRU goes down, the other one kicks on, and everything keeps going to the pipeline.
Interesting. I haven't seen that. That's great. There's a question here that if I can find it here, hang on. If anyone can answer this, you get a free lunch. Does the carbon credit qualify for the IRS 45Q credit?
I don't have that answer, but we can look.
I don't think we have the answer for that. Question about what's the fate of wells far away from pipelines that produce at low rates and really can't handle increased costs? What's their path to reducing emissions?
I'll take that on. What I've seen is that there is an industry starting to build small, relatively inexpensive combustors. I think that's probably the most reasonable solution for those remote wells with small volumes. And it's obviously we'd like to capture and sell gas from every well that we could, but there's some practical limitations, and these small, highly efficient combustors are probably the best way to go.
I think there's a lot of other potential technologies that are out there. I've heard of units that can convert gas to NGLs. I think if you could use that gas to potentially fire something else at your site, or I think that there are ways to get there, but definitely the pipeline capacity is a limiting factor.
Okay, we have a question about someone further interest in the EcoVapor unit. Actually, if you just contact me after this webinar, we'd be glad to talk about it. And Kat, I just had a question for you. Do you have any data or feel when you contrasted recovery upstream of the tanks or the tower versus capturing from? Do you have any feel of the quantification of the difference or the emission reduction from a different configuration? Any feel of the effect of that?
Well, I think if you want to go back to that slide, we can look directly at what EcoVapor's client was able to see directly. So maybe James, can we back up to the slide that Peter shared on their example?
Yeah, no problem. Let me just navigate over there. There we go.
Yeah, so Peter, you want to kind of walk us through a little bit more detail? I know you wanted to go quickly, but it looks like we want some more info on this.
Sure. Well, this is again the test that was done up in the Powder River Basin. We also have done tests in Texas as well. But this was the longer one where they ran it for 11 weeks through the VRT, and then 11 weeks through, basically capturing everything off the tanks. The production stayed approximately the same. The operator was very interested in making sure that this was a viable test. You can see the gas capture went from 137 MCF a day to 188. Capture efficiency basically rose to about as high as you can get at 98%. The interesting thing is the difference in the richness of the gas coming off of the tanks, going from 2100 BTU up to almost 2700. And if you've got processing rights, and this is something that is important to consider, is we often do our economics based on a BTU uplift. But if you, and most operators these days do have processing rights, because it's such a rich stream and so concentrated in the longer chain hydrocarbons, which are worth so much these days, and propane plus is the economics can be quite a bit higher. This operator did it simply on the BTU uplift, but that number probably would double if you're looking at processing rights as well.
Okay, James, I think we're out of time.
That was probably one of the more involved Q&As we've had in a webinar, and I think it speaks to the importance of this topic. So I just want to let me just pop in here real quick. I just want to thank you, Sam and Kat, for joining us today on the webinar. Your expertise is very important today, and we'll have some contact information here at the end of the presentation. So thanks again for joining us, and Peter and Jeff, thanks for putting this all on and making it happen. So hopefully this will be a great resource for the industry as time goes by. I know there's going to be a lot more changes. It seems like every day there's a new change, right, Kat? So before you go, just a couple reminders. Be sure to download that PDF that's on the handout section of your GoToWebinar control panel. If you have an opportunity, head on up to ecovaporrs.com and sign up for email alerts. We get on the email list because we are doing these webinars on a regular basis. You don't want to miss one that's coming up. Of course, contact the group with any questions. This information is also in the handout. Jeff's contact and Sam and Kat's are on here. Please feel free to reach out to them. So this concludes today's webinar. Thank you very much, and have a great rest of your day.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you.